How do you find the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Piece of cake. I'll tell you why it's easy. Again, I go back to the idea that if you don't ask the right question, you might not get the right answer. The answer you see. There is only, and by the way, I have never seen the right question asked on any material I've ever read by anybody, anytime, anywhere, from any point in history as to who's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I've never seen anybody ask the only question they should have asked. There's only one question. Here it is. I don't know if it's up here. Oh yeah, there it is. If all the terrible things associated with the Exodus actually occurred in Egypt, even remotely as the Bible describes that, what would have happened to Egypt?
Culture would be destroyed.
I mean, that is such an obvious question. So therefore, what you do is you would look for, well, first of all, you got to get what I call the chronological ballpark. That's pretty easy. I wouldn't even waste too much time messing with that. You just take the earliest possible date for the Exodus ever proposed and the latest possible date for the Exodus proposed. And you said, okay, where in that ballpark did Egypt collapse on the weight of these Exodus days? By the way, the answer to that question is, the time frame is all of the 18th and 19th dynasties. So we have proposed dates in the 18th dynasty, 15th century. We have proposed dates going down to the 19th dynasty, 13th century. So we'll give an entire spread of the 18th and 19th dynasties as our ballpark. And examine the ballpark and find out when Egypt collapsed. And it only happened once. There weren't two collapses or two near collapses or two almost collapses. There was only one big collapse. It's very big, it's very obvious, and it only happened just one time. Right? So, how long should it take us to identify the Pharaoh of the Exodus? As fast as it takes us to run through the 18th dynasty. All right, here we go. Here's the ancient Near East during the Hyksos period. By 1700 BC, the Semitic people from Canaan had overrun the Egyptian Delta region, Lower Egypt, and they ruled. They woke up one day and they said, there's about 10 of us for every one native Egyptian. How come they're in charge and we're not? And so they took over. We won't debate how they took over, why they took over. We just say they did, and they did. Now, Theban Egypt was in a vassal state of the powerful Hyksos. And what's interesting here is that you've got to look at this. They actually ruled all the way up. This was their homeland, so they ruled all the way up into the Levant. So they had control over all of this area. Now, in the north, we have to talk about some other kingdoms. Now, why are we going to talk about so many kingdoms that you never heard of? Because they played prominent roles in this whole thing. And we know the Egyptians are not going to ever tell us the truth.
Right.
They're inveterate
liars,
propagandists for their own purposes. And one thing you don't do in the Near East is advertise your weaknesses. All right, so we're going to talk about other cultures. And one of them is Mitanni. Sometimes you see it with two T's and one N, and sometimes you see it with one T and two N's. Anson Randy says two T's and one N, and one N. So there you go, Mitanni. Who are these guys? Indo-European Hurrians, Indo-European speaking folks, speaking a language that eventually gives rise to the European languages and so on. And they're ruling over a Semitic population of northern Mesopotamia during this period, starting to rule about the time that the Hyksos rise in Egypt. Mitannis, very strong. We got some other folks down there. The Assyrians, you've heard of them. Now the Assyrians, at this time, are appended to Mitanni. They are a vassal state of the Mitannian kingdom. But we put them in here because they're going to play a role here shortly. Then we have another group, Hatti. Hatti, that's where the Hatti. And the Hatti folks from the land of Hatti, thankfully, not some other place. And so all the terminology lines up. Now, who are the Hattians? They're the biblical Hittites. By the way, the Bible is not called Hittites. They're called men of Hat. The word is identical to what the Hittites called themselves in the period. The men of Hat or Hatti. And I wish we could talk chronology and talk about why in the world there are Hattians and Philistines in the time of Abraham, which there were. Very easy to see. So anyway, here are the kingdoms. Here are our players. Now, let's play this thing out. The Hyksos were driven out of Egypt by Thutmose in his 19th year. Some say around 1540 BC, some say 1541. You never know about these things exactly, but it's somewhere in there. So he drives the Hyksos out of Egypt for the first time in a long time, 150 years. Hyksos had been there. He kicks them out. And not only that, but he walls up the eastern border of Egypt. From the Suez to the Mediterranean, he builds walls, forts, canals, and just shores that thing up. Why? Because he's going to kick these people out, not the people, the rulers, the armies. He runs them out and enslaves the rest. Okay, so he's so enslaved the whole. He institutes an official 18th dynasty policy of enslavement of and hatred of Asiatic Semitic people, including all those good Hebrews from the patriarchs who are now down there, the tribes of Israel, sons of Jacob. All right, so he enslaves them, and not only that, he walls Egypt up to protect them from any of those incursions ever happening again, and Egypt, from this point on, now not in his reign, but eventually, what they're going to do is they're going to keep on over and over and over again attacking Canaan and Syria in slave raids and keeping the area sufficiently depopulated to avoid a repeat of the Hyksos debacle. I mean, this was a horrible, ugly period for the Egyptians. Having been ruled over by Semitic Asiatics, this was terrible. So they were going to make sure this never happened again. Now, by the way, let me go back to Thutmose. So what does he do? If you have just reunified Egypt, there's always two Egypts, one upper, one lower, and two crowns. When you unify Egypt after 150 years of really a bad period, economically bad, not really good at all, what do? He spent his entire reign building infrastructure, rebuilding the economy, rebuilding the army. In other words, just fixing things. That's what he does for his whole period. His son, well, actually not his son, this is kind of a cousin, and he comes to power, and he does the same thing. Basically, Egypt is just still fixing. I'm going to go through this pretty fast. But things are getting better. Things are getting better. Egypt's getting stronger. And finally, we come to Thutmose I. Now, he wakes up one morning, and he thinks, well, I got the army. The army's back, good shape. Economy's back, great shape. We got so much gold coming in from Nubia, we don't even know what to do with it. Kingdom's strong, infrastructure's strong, everything's strong. I think we need an empire. He's the first Egyptian in history, first Egyptian pharaoh in history to have imperial vision. We're going to expand the kingdom. And you know what his vision was? Let's push the border of Egypt from the Plusiac branch of the Nile. Whoa. How does that happen? There we go. That's what happens when they put the laser button right next to the advance button. Plusiac branch of the Nile right here. Let's move the border of Egypt from there to the Euphrates River. Great! Problem. The Mitanni, who locked up this land between the Euphrates here and the Tigris here, who ruled this land, also had a corridor to the sea. Why? Because that's where the money was. The money is in the Mediterranean trade. The economy is in the Mediterranean basin. So they're landlocked here, but what they want is access to the coastal cities of the north. And thereby they have the Mediterranean trade. Who else wants the Mediterranean trade, you suppose? Egypt has no problem with it because they've got the whole Egyptian coast. The Hittites want it. The Hittites badly want to control this area. Problem, the Mitannis are too strong for them. Because this is stretching Hittite supply lines a little too far from the capital here, Thutmose, a little bit too far. They can't really do much about it. So the Hittites really want it, but they can't do much about it. They're dreaming about it, but it's not happening. All right? That's the world in the time of Thutmose I. Now, what does he do? He drives his armies all the way to the Euphrates River. Takes his armies and drives them all the way to the Euphrates River, sets up a great big stela, big billboard, stone billboard on the Euphrates River that says, you know, how great he is. I'm wonderful, I'm the king of the world, I'm Thutmose I, and this is the new Egyptian border on the Euphrates River. Great. Turns around and marches back home about the time. And by the way, he's gone to every city in the region, just one at a time, and basically said, you can either become a nice cooperative vassal state of Egypt and be part of our territory, or you can die. Which will it be? And they all said, no problemo. You got it. And so he thinks everybody's just really fine with all of this. And by the time he gets over the hill, going home, guess what happens?
There we go.
Mitanni comes back in and says, you what? You're going to come back with us, aren't you? Or die? Oh, sure. Yeah, Thutmose, he's gone. No problem. So they immediately revert right back to the Mitanni. Well, Thutmose thinks he's got all this locked up, but it's not happening. So what has he got? He's got an empire in his head. He's got imperial visions, but he really doesn't have much reality behind it. Oh, he goes up periodically and beats up on a few Canaanite and Syrian kings, but he really doesn't have this thing locked down. He thinks he's got it, but you notice that I haven't put a lot of weight to it. It's a little bit ethereal. All right. Come Thutmose II, same thing. Same thing. He dies a little young. And we think his wife had something to do with it. Her name was Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut always wanted to be king, not queen. She was queen, but she wanted to be king. She wanted to be Pharaoh and rule everything. And he died fairly young. And probably, she slipped a little glass into the oatmeal periodically, something, and so he dies. And then she comes to power. However, she is not the crown prince. She is not supposed to be Pharaoh. She takes over as Pharaoh. The crown prince, little Thutmose III, is only 5 years old. Well, he's really the Pharaoh, but she's going to sort of take care of things until he can get old enough to take over. And so, in short, wish we had time to tell all these stories because they're lots of fun. She rules for the next 20 years. And by the way, she's pretty good. She's tough. She really can handle things. She does a really good job. She's running armies up into the Asiatic territories, and she's taking care of business. Oh, and by the way, who's really taking care of business in the Asiatic territories? None other than Thutmose III, the Pharaoh, who is, as all good pharaohs of the 18th dynasty do before they become king, as they all do, they become the conqueror of Canaan, and Syria. They become the commander of the northern armies of Amarna. 4 divisions in the north, the bulk of the Egyptian army, they become commander, sometimes at 10, 11, 12 years old. Okay? They're raised from the time they're little to do this. And so he has been the commander. Now notice, by the time she reaches about her 20th year, remember Thutmose was 5 when she took over, and now how old is he?
25.
He's 25 years old. I think he's sitting up there in the field bivouac with his troops up there in Syria somewhere. And he's thinking, I'm 25 years old. My father was Pharaoh long before this. I am the Pharaoh. Why am I up here and my auntie Hatshepsut is down there? It wasn't his mother. My auntie Hatshepsut is down there ruling Egypt. Guess what? Next thing we know, 20 years is up for her and she's gone. And all the monuments of Egypt are having her face hacked off. And her cartouches gouged out. They're trying to erase her memory as much as possible in a very ugly, violent way. Now, no historian's been able to really pin this directly on Thutmose III, but what do you think? Yeah. So he takes over. Now, thankfully for him, she's already wasted 20 of his years on the throne. So, thankfully, he's got 34 more years to rule. Right? He lives a long time. So he gets to actually rule on the throne 34 more years. So technically his reign is 54 years long. But 34 in his own right. Now, let me introduce Thutmose III because he's just the coolest guy. I love this guy. If I had to be one guy in antiquity, this is him. I would be this guy. He was the greatest pharaoh in the history of Egypt, bar none. He had more power, had more territory, had more gold, had more wealth, had a better economy, had everything going for him. And not only that, he's a brilliant, brilliant warrior. One of the greatest warrior kings / generals ever in the history of the ancient world. We have his annals of his battles. One, the Battle of Megiddo, is fabulously recorded. One of the great detailed battle accounts of the ancient world. Now, Thutmose III is able to do one thing better than any other pharaoh since Thutmose I, who had the imperial visions. He actually solidifies the empire. He systematically has his troops checking in. He's actually setting up Egyptian governance at every location. And he is able to bring about a strong Egyptian hegemony over this entire region. So ironclad control. Complete, total control for the first time in Egypt's history. They have an empire running all the way to the fifth cataract of Nile in the south into Nubia, all the way to the Euphrates River in the north. This is Egypt. Okay? Now, things are going great. Now, of course, there's always this perennial problem. They're always having a battle against the Mitanni. They're always having to skirmish up there. And so this is a problem. But all good things have to come to an end. But there's this flashpoint that's always difficult. Thankfully, Thutmose III brought his son, Amenhotep II, onto the throne. By the way, since Thutmose I, this has all been father-son. Okay? Father-son, father-son, father. It wasn't before that, but now it is. That's why it's known as the Thutmose dynasty. All right? So, here's his son. He brought Amenhotep II onto the throne 10 years before he died. As co-regent. Very smart move. Now, why was this smart? Because you know what would happen in Canaan and Syria every time a pharaoh died? Every time they got wind of a pharaoh dying, you know what happened? Rebellion. You don't want to be ruled over by these people. Why? Because they have two commodities in Canaan. Biblically, these are identified always very well. There are two commodities that you got in Canaan that Egypt and Mesopotamia can't get on their own. Not good anyway. Two things that Canaan had. Canaanite wine Canaanite olive oil. Olive oil and wine, two commodities that Canaan... By the way, olive trees are indigenous to Canaan. They were eventually imported around the rest of the Mediterranean, but they are indigenous to Canaan. This is why Canaanite olive oil, Palestinian olive oil today is the best. Yeah, all that Italian, Greek stuff. Palestinian olive oil. It's growing where God put it in the first place. Okay. Olive oil and the wine of Canaan, the best. Why? Because it has that nice climate, the hills and all of that. You don't have that in Egypt. It's too hot. You can grow grapes down there, but the wine is terrible. All right? So, what do you got? If you're a Canaanite or a Syrian, you have these great commodities, and if you're not ruled over, if you're not subject to anybody, you get to sell it. If you are subject to somebody like Egypt and Mesopotamia, you get to give it as tribute. So you got to give it away free. So you want to give it away free, or you want to sell it? You want to sell it. So they hate being an Egyptian vassal, right? So every time they get wind of a pharaoh's death, they rebel. And they did it after Thutmose III died. There were some rebellions, particularly up in Syria. 5 Syrian state kings rebelled up in Syria when he died. And Amenhotep II had to go take care of the problem. Here's how he took care of it. He marched north, found out, and by the way, he goes parallel. He has the army going north here along the way of Horus, or the way of the Philistines, the Bible calls it, going this way, and he has a parallel flotilla of ships going up the coast following. He finds these city-state kings and arrests them, captures them, takes them over to his ship, ties them to the prow of his ship naked, gives them each an attendant to keep them alive. You know, you've got to keep feeding water, keep them alive, and he floats them all the way back to Egypt, all the way up the Nile to Thebes. Cleans them up, dresses them up, puts them in all the finery, and has a great ceremony at the Temple of Luxor, in which he personally doesn't have someone do it himself for him. He has it done by his own hand. He cuts all their heads off. He personally executes them by cutting their heads off. This guy's tough. Now, his father, the great Thutmose III, greatest pharaoh in the history of Egypt, had a lot of class, had a lot of finesse. So he's probably rolling over in his grave with this activity. He probably would be happy with it. But Amenhotep II is a thug, a self-proclaimed thug. I mean, he says, and by the way, we have his mummy. We have the mummy of all these guys, the whole 18th dynasty mummy. And Thutmose III looks just like Abraham Lincoln. In death, he looks like Abraham Lincoln did in life. I mean, really, it's just like him. And but his son, Amenhotep II, he's got a few different genes in there. He's short, squat, wide, strong, powerful man. And in fact, he said he had a composite bow so strong that only he could pull it. That was his biggest boast. But anyway, tough guy. But now notice what's happened. From the first day of the dynasty, from Thutmose, things got better, kept getting better. Things got really strong under Thutmose III. They were continuing to get better during his reign. Oh, by the way, let me finish the ceremony. He cuts all their heads off. Has their bodies chopped into little pieces. With little notes attached to them. And he ships them all over the kingdom. All over Syria and Canaan. And the note basically says, don't mess with Amenhotep II. That's the last problem he had with Canaan and Syria. All good things come to an end. But the kingdom got stronger. The kingdom didn't get weaker. I'll tell you why. It has now been suggested by Redford that Thutmose IV just might be the greatest pharaoh of all the Egyptian pharaohs. Why? Because he did something that none of his predecessors had ever done. Not only was he already known by about age 12 as the conqueror of Syria and Canaan, because he became the commander of the northern armies, but he was a great charioteer, always depicts himself as the greatest charioteer ever in the history of Egypt. But he had an idea. He kept thinking this, you know what? Every time we have to go up here and keep this border at the Euphrates River, we're always having to butt heads with the Mitannis. Why are we doing this? Why don't we make them an offer? We got more gold than we know what to do with. Why don't we make a little brotherhood pact with them and just nail this thing down forever? They can become our blood brothers. I'll take a princess and we'll put her in the harem down here. Now we'll all be a happy family. And they can declare the Euphrates as the northern border of Egypt. And they can become our guardian of that border against all comers in the region. They'll guard it for us. And not only that, because they're our blood brother buddies, we will give them all access to the Mediterranean through that corridor that they want. It's a happy arrangement for everybody. It was brilliant. The only downside was this. We know for about 50 years prior to his time, both the Mitannians and the Hittites in their embassies in Egypt had been trying to put a deal together, a treaty together with Egypt. The Hittites really wanted to get this treaty, to cut the Mitannis out and put them in, so they'd have access to the corridor. But Thutmose IV chose, well, for him, he chose wisely. For the rest of the history of Egypt, for the next dynasty, it wasn't a very good choice. Because he should have sided with Hatti for the long haul. However, in short-sightedness, and it was good for Egypt at the time, he sided with Mitanni, and guess what? Before the ink was dry on that treaty, Hatti became the sworn enemy of Egypt. Hatti was angered. Because between the power of Egypt and the power of Mitanni combined in this region, there is no way to get in the northern Syrian corridor. They're not going to get it. They want it, they can't get it. So now they are the enemy of Egypt. Nothing they can do about it. Well, Thutmose IV is seen as a brilliant pharaoh for this reason. Now Egypt doesn't have to expend all the funds all the time to go guard this region. It's all happy love fest, and everybody's just having a great time. Egypt is now stronger than it ever has been. It is not having to just expend funds on military activity in the north. So they have the strongest that they've ever had. Now, something happened. We've got this Egypto-Mitannian alliance by the end of his reign. Hatti's been cut out. But something happens. Thutmose IV dies an untimely death. He dies between age 25 and 30 years old, by 27-ish. And watch what happens when he dies. First thing that happens is the Egypto-Mitannian alliance evaporates. In fact, by this time, King Tushratta of Mitanni has been writing letters. We have some of them in the Amarna tablets, in the Amarna letters in Egypt. Keeps writing letters to Amenhotep III saying, "Where's my gold? What's wrong? Why aren't you answering your mail? What happened to our relationship?" Nothing's happening. Well, not only that, not only does the Egypto-Mitannian alliance dry up, the border disappears. And for some strange reason, during the reign of Amenhotep III, he withdraws Egypt entirely from the Levant. Egypt pulls out mysteriously. It has been obligatory for every pharaoh up to this point, for the last 150 years, to have a border at the Euphrates River. And now, for some weird reason, Amenhotep III is pulling out. By the way, if you're going to maintain strong Egyptian strength in the area, where's your only staging area? the Delta region. If something happens here, you have to pull back. He is pulling back for some reason. Something has happened to Egypt that Egypt's not telling us about. Everybody else knows. The Egyptians are not telling us that. That's why we need these other folks to tell us what's going on. Well, by the way, he rules for exactly 38 years. Very solid numbers. 38 years. How long were the Israelites wandering before they moved on onto the plateau above the plains of Moab and then down? Well, the number in Deuteronomy is 38. 38 years they wandered. Now, another thing happens during the reign of Amenhotep III. In about his 20th year, the Hittites march across the Euphrates River, attack the Mitanni capital of Washington, and destroy them. Capital's gone. I just shrink Mitanni here because it's not quite gone yet. Suppiluliuma is the Hittite king. He's going to come back later and finish the job. For right now, Mitanni's just reduced to just a fraction of what it had been. Now, look at this. All of a sudden, Suppiluliuma, the great Hittite warrior king, feels free to attack the Mitanni kingdom, which is the brother of Egypt, with impunity, without fear of any reprisal from Egypt. He just marches over there and wipes them out. Very interesting. What does he know? He knows in his reconnoitering of Egypt that Egypt is not able to respond. And I promise you, Egypt would have contained control of the Levant had they been able to. They didn't because they wouldn't. They didn't because they couldn't. They could not maintain control. Something happened in Egypt to cause them to collapse back into their borders. Hatti then took the corridor they always wanted. Now they've got the corridor to the sea. They've locked up northern Syria, and here they are. Now, this is quite amazing. Assyria now has been cut loose from Mitanni, who was the brother of Egypt, now destroyed. Assyria then grows into what we now know eventually in the late Bronze Age to become the old Assyrian empire. But they're gaining in strength now. Now, comes the next Pharaoh, Akhenaten. Akhenaten has no foreign policy. He's an embarrassment to Horemheb, who's later going to give us be the first king of the next dynasty after this dynasty totally collapses. This is an embarrassing period. By the way, Akhenaten changes the religion of Egypt from the typical many gods to a quasi or a near monotheism by declaring the sun disk, the Aten, as the new god and the only god to be worshipped. Evidently, Egypt is falling apart. The Egyptian gods aren't helping one bit. And he saw his father collapse, and now he's having problems too, so he just reinvents the whole religion of Egypt. He wasn't born into it, he invented it. He was born Amenhotep IV. Changes his name, quits worshipping Amun, becomes Akhenaten, the beloved of the Aten. Akhenaten. Very bizarre period of history. But Egypt is failing. Egypt is collapsing around its ears. And by the way, you know what else we know about the reign of Akhenaten that not too many people talk about? Plagues. Plagues are still, somehow, have started back in the reign of Amenhotep III. They're ravaging Egypt, and they're still ravaging Egypt at this time. And they're still ravaging Egypt in the time of King Tut. Here's our famous King Tut, a boy king, who had everything in his tomb stolen from other tombs, basically thrown in there at the last minute. And still wonderful stuff, however. But he only rules for 9 years. But I want to show you what happened at the end of his rule. Look at this. When he died, his widow, Ankhesenamun, was alarmed because they had no kids, no sons, no heirs. As a result of that, and by the way, this is what I call the most bizarre episode in the history of the Near East. Here is his weirdness multiplied. She writes a letter to the enemy Supi-Luliuma, king of the Hittites. And she says, "Dear Supi, help! My husband has died." I'm going to give you, this is verbatim quote. "My husband has died. We have no sons. I hear you have many sons. If you will send one of your sons to be my husband, he will sit on the throne of Egypt." Whoa! Here's the queen of Egypt writing to the enemy Hittites, requesting one of his sons to be her husband so that he might be the Pharaoh of Egypt, in essence offering Egypt as a vassal state ruled by the son of their number one enemy. That's just bizarre. In fact, Supi-Luliuma thought it was nuts. Mercilli II, his son, we have his annals, he talks about his father raging through the palace with his hands on his head, saying things like, "What is happening here? This has never happened to me in my whole life. What are they trying to pull?" So he sends an envoy. He sends an entourage down to Egypt to check it out. And they go down and they meet with Ankhesenamu. They meet with her, and she flies off the handle. She's really upset. She thinks she hasn't been taken seriously. She sends another letter with the entourage back to Hattusis. Off they go. They get to Supi-Luliuma a few weeks later, and they say, "It's a real deal. Here's the letter. Read it yourself." And he reads it. She quotes verbatim from her first letter. "My husband has died," and on she goes. And she says at the end of it, "Who else have I appealed to? Would I embarrass my kingdom in front of who else? What other king have I appealed to but you?" And the guys are going, "Okay." So he picks out one of his poor sons and sends him off with the entourage back to Egypt. This is making a great movie. As soon as he gets close to the border of Egypt, he's assassinated. Now, do you think Supi-Luliuma is happy at this point? No. But here's what happens. Supi-Luliuma knows that Egypt is not in a position to do anything. They have just offered him themselves. And they're just given the whole kingdom of Egypt away. Now he's going to take it by force. He's going to take it by force. And he knows they can't stop it. So now look at this. He's already in Syria. He's already camped at the anti-Lebanons here. And so all he has to do is just march down the highway to Egypt, and he's got it. Guess what? He starts putting his troops together. They start mobilizing. Everybody starts getting sick. Now, remember this entourage going back and forth from Hattusis to Egypt and back and forth? Guess what they contracted? Several plagues. And we don't know what the plagues were. Chickenpox, influenza, who knows? They contracted plagues, and the soldiers started dying so fast they couldn't mobilize and march on Egypt. Not only that, but the disease went all the way rampantly through the Hittite kingdom and almost took them down. Almost, not quite. They survived. What's interesting about that, I'll come back in just a minute. Now, Horemheb is an old general. He's an old general. He basically puts one of his old army buddies called Pharaoh A.Y., puts him on the throne. And basically what we've got here is the end of the 18th dynasty. The 18th dynasty has crashed and burned. Now, I just want to review it. By the way, Ramesses the Great comes to the throne. There is no glitch, power glitch in the reign of Ramesses the Great. 64 years on the throne. Exodus can't occur there. Now, there's another reason why, too. Ramesses, by the way, eventually has to butt his head with the Hittites. They fight. back and forth, all kinds of battles, Archaeology's famous battle. Eventually, you know what the Hittites and the Egyptians do? Treaty time. And so they finally just say, hey, let's quit fighting. Let's just draw a treaty. We'll take the north, you take the south. Let's end this thing. They did. Happily ever after. Until the Hittites eventually collapsed a couple centuries later. But anyway, nice story. Here's what I think. The decline of the collapse of the 18th dynasty has to be attributable to the events of the Exodus. Here they are. 10 plagues, plundering of wealth, loss of labor force, loss of military Delta force. They're in the Delta, I hadn't called them the Delta force. And loss of Pharaoh. If those 5 things happen to Egypt, what happens to Egypt? They collapsed. And they collapsed. Now, watch, this is even more dramatic. These are the power ratings for Egypt's 18th dynasty pharaohs based on the strength of Egyptian hegemony in Canaan and Syria. Why is that the barometer? Because in order to do that, they have to have a strong presence of power and a presence and a good economy and a good military in the Delta region. That's the only staging area for which they can support and control in the north. Now watch this. Almost no power. They're just getting Egypt back together. Then we get to Thutmose I. He gets an imperial vision. He pushes some of his troops up. But really the hegemony is not realized until they keep getting stronger. But in Thutmose III's reign, now we got the power. And now we're really in control of all those northern lands. So they've been ramping up. Everything's getting stronger. When he dies, Amenhotep cements it even further. When he dies, it's cemented even further with a treaty. Okay, so we have strong, Egypt's riding high. But watch what happens in the next pharaohs. Just collapse. From that point, we have a precipitous decline in Egypt. Now, by the way, there's not going to be a total and complete collapse. Why? Because we need it for the rest of the Bible. We've got to have Shishak, and we've got to have Necho, and all the rest of it. But there it is. I mean, that's the only place in our entire target area, target ballpark, that's the only place we get an Egyptian collapse. Now, what's interesting is, during the reign of Thutmose IV, here's the power ratings in the Near East. Egypt is number 1, by far. Mitanni is number 2. Hatti is number 3. And Assyria is number 4. Now watch what happened. In the reign of one pharaoh, from the very next pharaoh, watch what happens to the power ratings. Hatti becomes number 1. Assyria becomes number 2. Egypt becomes a distant 3rd. And Mitanni is wiped off the face of the earth. In one pharaoh. Just one generation. A boom. Gone. There you go. I think that's got to be it. Can't explain it any other way. Well, here's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Oh, I'm sorry. That's his papa. There's Amenhotep II. Oh, and then we have, this is Thutmose IV. Here he is. Here's Amenhotep II. This is Daddy. By the way, he would have been the Pharaoh on the throne while Moses was in exile. Here is him and his mom, Tia. So here's mom. And here's his cartouche, Men Kefer U. Read it like this. Men Kefer U Ra. Men Kefer U Ra. By the way, that's just one letter different. Just this letter added. His grandfather, Thutmose III, was Men Kefer Ra. He's Men Kefer U Ra. And so there's his little cartouche, one of them. He has 5 different names. Here he is, Thutmose IV. By the way, this is one panel of his chariot. His actual chariot was found in his tomb, in the hallway of his tomb, which had been robbed. But it was still there, and it has Thutmose III, Thutmose IV, riding over his enemies. Who are all these folks? Canaanites! Well, you can't tell a Canaan. If you're an Egyptian, you can't tell a Canaanite. headdress, typical Semitic headdress. So he's riding over them. He's the perfect Pharaoh. By the way, he styles himself as the greatest charioteer in the history of Egypt. He's the perfect guy to go chasing after the Hebrews out of the wilderness on a chariot, leading his chariot forces. So he fits perfectly. Here he is. Did I just skip one? Oh, here we are. Here he is. Thutmose IV. Isn't it weird to be able to look into the face of historical characters? We could do all the mummies of this dynasty and the next. Got them all. It's really quite amazing. Whoops. What did I just do? Here he is. By the way, he's very handsome. Well coiffed. He's got great earrings. Great manicure. But it's really interesting. I noticed one thing. G. Elliott Smith did an examination, a forensic examination of all the Egyptian mummies of the 18th and 19th dynasties around the turn of the 19th century, 19th, 20th century. It's about 1900. By the way, that examination was so accurate, so complete, comprehensive, that when another team of forensic investigators about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, re-examined all the mummies, they decided just to do a reprint on G. Elliott Smith's report. They really couldn't add anything to it. He said something in his report about Thutmose IV. Number one, he's healthy. He has no pathogens. He has no arrows sticking in his back. He looks like he's in great shape. Except he made a really strange observation. Well, I thought it was strange. He says, Thutmose IV, at the time of his death, was extremely emaciated. Now, the reason that phrase caught my attention was, when it comes to mummies, from my lay point of view, all mummies look rather emaciated to me. I mean, they all basically look like beef jerky. So what was it that he was looking at? There was something about muscle mass or something. Anyway, he looks at this guy, and he doesn't say this about any of the other pharaohs. He said, this particular mummy, at the time of death, is extremely emaciated. In other words, this fellow was pining away. He was not eating right. He was not drinking right. He was worried sick. Well, wouldn't you be if your kingdom was falling around your ears? For months or years, things are just falling apart, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, you already have the question. Some of you always already have the question in your head, because I get asked this many times when we talk about this. Well, if this is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, how come we have this mummy?
Right.
Thought he died in the sea. Remember I told you earlier today? Read the text. The text says that after they were killed in the water, drowned in the water, the next morning, the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the shore.
Eastern Shore.
Now, they would have sacrificed 1,000 slaves to get the body of the Pharaoh. And they got it. Why did they have to get it? Because according to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, all of that has to be done properly in order. They have to mummify, they have to go through all the procedure, or the black land is going to get swallowed up by the red land. It's very bad juju if you don't do this. So they have to do it. So they got him, and they, of course, obligatorily took out all of his organs and all that. And stuffed him in natron for 70 days, and basically beef jerky. All right, so here he is. I think he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I don't have another choice. So what happened? Remember when Amenhotep II, his son, came to the power, everything collapsed. Everything just went backwards. What Egypt had accomplished, all those many pharaohs before him, just went undone, just came apart. And when it came apart, it was ugly. Hati marches on Mitanni. Mitanni goes out of the picture. The Egyptian brother is gone. Hati then is being asked to save Egypt. But what's interesting about this is this means that Joshua would have come in to conquer Canaan in the second year of Akhenaten. 40 years later, Joshua comes in under Pharaoh Akhenaten. What's really interesting about that, I don't have time to talk about the conference. Joshua, but here's it in a nutshell. Remember, going all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, okay, all the way to Joshua and Moses, God had been promising the Israelites an Egyptianless Canaan. I'm going to give you a land in which there are Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Jebusites, Hivites, Perizzites, termites. Oh my God. But notice no Egyptians. If the late Bronze Age is known, and it is known, as the time of Egyptian domination of Canaan, where are the Egyptians in the story of Joshua's conquest? They are not there. I promise you, if you study this more carefully, you will see that there is a tiny historical window in which Joshua could have possibly come into Canaan without Egyptian presence. And that's during the reign of Akhenaten. Not only that, but why did God keep them in the wilderness during the entire reign of his father? Because we had to wait till the land had Hittites. Because there was no Hittite presence, not officially. Yeah, a few meandering migrants here and there. But there was no Hittite presence politically, socio-politically in Canaan until when? 20th year of Amenhotep III. So there's a tiny little window in which we're going to have Hittites, Canaanites, and Amorites living in the Promised Land without Egyptians. And that's exactly what happened here. When Joshua marched in, he marched into an Egyptianless Canaan. And I'm going to cut it off right here. I wish I could talk about this because there's some really exciting stuff here. But once you nail this down, once you've got the Pharaoh of the Exodus at Thutmose IV, everything else in the Bible lines up with precision, including the first judge and the first oppressor in the book of Judges. Because he is the first judge, the first oppressor is named Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. He's a Mitanni. He's a Mitanni warlord. He can't exist, but for a bit. Because the Mitannis were completely wiped off the face of the earth before the end of the 14th century. By 1420, 1410, they were history. Gone. Which means you can't have a late date for the Exodus. I'm sorry. Because Cushan is Indo-European. He belongs to the Mitannian realm. He ruled, he's a Rishathaim of the Risi people who are in that area, the Indo-Europeans. King of Naharaim, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. That's them. That's him. That's the only time we have Indo-Europeans ruling over Mesopotamia. That's it.